Well, howdy ho there. This is Pseudoregalia. How you doing? Hopefully you're doing absolutely peachy keen fantastic. I got this game from a friend of mine, and I rather like the game, and I think it's pretty cool and good. And I was going to use it as a backdrop to talk about a bunch of stuff. I mean, today I wanted to talk a little bit about humility and humbleness and meekness a little bit because I think that those things are actually pretty important. But yeah, this game is also just to talk about for just a second. Though this game is pretty cool. It's basically a platformer. Well, it's a platformer with like a little bit of combat and all that fun stuff. The animation kind of looks interesting. It almost looks a little bit like not stop motion exactly, but it looks like there's like not as many frames, but I think it actually gives it a pretty nice, unique look. But anyway. I noticed that as I've been through a lot of these spiritual YouTube communities, and recently I've been kind of digging through a lot of different things, just trying to come up with some notes and some things that I could maybe talk about later on in different videos and things like that. And one of the things that kind of kept popping up, I noticed, was that people seem to be very willing to talk about, like, oh man, I'm really far along the path because XYZ event happened. Like, they'll have little events in their life that will make them think, oh yes, I am the bestest that's ever been. And sometimes you'll even get this, like, with this kind of like weird Christian thing where the people will be like trying to out meek each other. I've seen that a couple of times, but I've also seen people who are like sitting there talking about like how like strong of a Christian spiritual warrior they are and all this other stuff. And one of the things that I actually think makes a lot of this stuff very interesting is that, to me, I would think that the best thing to be would be to be humble and to recognize your faults, because if you recognize your faults, then you can kind of move past them, or you can like look at them and be like, okay, well, this is something that I do that is wrong. I can kind of at least attempt to correct for it. And even if it's something that's really hard to break, like if it's a particular habit or something like that, you can still find ways around it and find ways to sort of, try to move past it, or at least try to, be better about it and be in a point where you can really engage more positively with things around you. Like if you're being a butt munch but you don't know you're being a butt munch, it's kind of a lot harder to correct than if you're just like, oh, I was maybe a little bit rude during that last conversation. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that you should be constantly self-deprecating and be like, oh, I'm just a terrible person all the time, because that's a whole other kettle of fish. And that's a whole other thing of like, sometimes when people try to be humble, they try to be almost like that, where they're just like constantly like putting themselves down. Like, that's not being humble. Being humble is just not, letting it go to your head and, understanding that you're still ultimately a mortal being and all that stuff. Well, mortal in the sense that you're not necessarily the most perfect, like at least on the surface. If we get really deep into Vedanta, they might say something slightly differently in the sense that what you really are is just the consciousness. But that's not what we're talking about right this moment. However, it is important to think about that. And, we also tend to do these things where we like really get into like the idea, at least in certain spiritual circles, of us being the most virtuous and the best people. And there were these two chapters from Zhuangzi. Is it Zhuangzi? Is it Zhuangzi or Zhuangzi or Zhuangzi? I don't know. Chinese philosopher who was Taoist and is Zhuangzi. I think is how you pronounce it, but I'm a cat. Meow. Anyway, but he had a couple of these little things that he had apparently written, and I found them online. And of course, something I would be cautious about is that sometimes you'll read like a source from something online, and it will say that it's from a certain person. Sometimes it's harder to quantify. I am not as familiar with his works. I am somewhat familiar with some of his philosophy and some of his ideas and things like that, because I personally find him pretty interesting, but I'm not 100% sure what book this is actually from. It might just be from the Zhuangzi. Yeah, no, it is. Okay, there it is. So it says. Anyway, therefore, the truly great man in this instance being like, person, basically, although he does not injure others, does not credit himself with charity and mercy. These are natural to him. He does not seek gain, but does not despise his followers who do. He struggles not for wealth, but does not take credit for leaving it alone. The ranks, and I've never heard this word before. Emulants, I don't know. The ranks of people of the world are to him no cause for joy. It's punishment and shame, no cause for disgrace. Basically, it's talking about being even-tempered here and realizing that you're just still like you're still being humble in the sense that you're not like, you know, it's sort of like when Jesus talks about like how people will go to the temple and they'll like pray and like they'll pray in front of everybody, right? Like, you could say that's being pious, but is that being pious, or is that actually someone just like trying to show off to you how virtuous and proper they are? And I would argue that there's definitely a difference there. What we really need to be doing is making sure that like we keep ourselves in check, and we are honest with ourselves about like what we go through, why we're going through what we're doing, what we desire out of this search for spirituality, and what we desire out of like all these other things. Like, if we're trying to become the greatest right off the bat, I would argue that's not really the point, is it? The point is more to be in a good community and get closer to the Lord. So specifically to get closer to the Lord. You know, it's just like Jesus says, you know, love the Lord your God with all your heart. And the second of these commandments is love your neighbor as yourself. This is like the whole of the law. Like, that is what we're really trying to do here. We're trying to understand these things, and we need to be humble. We need to be able to like look at these things and not be constantly going, oh yes, I'm at such and such spiritual level and this means that I'm doing so great, or, you know, I am just this absolutely wonderful person and I can do no wrong, and like, oh man, all these other things. Like, that's not the point of spirituality. The point of spirituality is actually growth, and part of growth is recognizing when you're having issues, when you are doing things that you're not supposed to do, or doing things that are not necessarily good for you, and trying to, you know, move past them, and trying to make sure that you're not just you know, wasting your time and the time of others by spending too much time aggrandizing yourself, especially. Like, that's one of the things I've noticed about a lot of spiritual circles, is that there's a lot of this just like kind of navel gazing and just being like, yes, I am so perfect and so great and so wonderful. And it's like, well, okay, and some of that is just to combat like anxiety and combat like, you know, negative things, and that's understandable to a certain extent. However, constantly dwelling on this idea that you, as you are right now, this being is perfect and that you have to change nothing, can be true in a spiritual sense. But if the person is not getting past their anxieties, if the person is not getting past like negativity, or they're not getting past anger and things like that, then it means that they still have a ways to go, and that's not like a terrible thing. That doesn't mean that you have to. Took me a second there to figure out what the button was to do the Healy thing. Or to remember, I should say. But we should still be willing to like look at our own mistakes and look at all these things and be like, okay, this is where I need to improve. That's why sometimes spiritual masters can be like a bit more harsh towards you. Now, all this being said, some might say, well, are you being humble because you're frequently doing this thing where you're not really super into the authority of like spiritual people or spiritual like masters and all that around you? It's like, well, I am willing to appeal if it seems that a spiritual master is actually like willing to, or actually has something that is useful. Like, you know, like, I'm not gonna just listen to someone like Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. I think it's Chogyam or Chogyam. Anyway, he was a Rinpoche who had like a lot of abuse scandals, did a lot of kind of inappropriate relationships with his students and stuff like that. And like, that guy is by many people's reckoning still a spiritual master, still a great person to some people. And it's like, well, I'm not gonna accept that. I'm not gonna accept that every spiritual master is like that. but we should still be humble. And that's not saying that I'm perfect. It's just saying that I don't want to take advice from someone that I think, you know, is doing things that are very wrong and bad. Like, I think that we need to have the certain level of self-confidence to be able to make decisions for ourselves and be willing to be confident in those decisions, but we also need to be willing to you know, be humble in saying that, like, we're not like the perfect ever, and we're not always the greatest, and that we can develop, and that even if ultimately our consciousness is like perfect as it is and is the witness and not the body and not the mind, we still need to like have this thing where we realize that and we're willing to grow and become, you know, more familiar with that and all this other stuff. We can't just be like, oh yes, I'm perfect, or, you know, like, ultimately in consciousness I am perfect, so I am perfect right now and literally nothing has to change. Oh, you know, if I hit someone, it's fine, it was just consciousness acting on consciousness. That doesn't mean that you're gonna like do that. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't be making excuses for yourself all the time. You should be willing to take responsibility for what's happened, willing to take a certain responsibility for certain mistakes, and also be willing to move past certain things and understand that, like, humility is partially just recognizing like the things that you've done that are wrong and being willing to grow from them. You know, like, you want to be able to grow from them, and that's part of why you want to recognize these things. Anyway, that's just what I wanted to share. That was just what was on my mind for at the moment. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and I hope that you know that I love you and God loves you, and bye-bye, I love you, bye. I hope you have an absolutely great one. Stay humble out there and try to connect to the Lord for big hugs and love. Okay? Okay, bye, I love you, bye. God loves you, bye. We all love you, bye, bye, bye.